Welcome everyone to today's episode of Fuel for Thought. I am very excited to welcome our dietetic intern, Alex Stoller. He is currently doing his master's in nutrition at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and also has a degree from Penn State University. Really excited to hear what Alex has for us today. He has been with us since about July and is kind of finishing up here in December. But one of his great new passion projects is learning about the athlete's gut. So excited to hear about what he has for us today. Take it away, Alex.
Thank you, Katie, for that awesome introduction. And welcome to another episode of Fuel for Thought. And as Katie mentioned, this episode is about an athlete's gut and how to optimize your gut health through nutrition and how that can impact your performance. So first, an introduction to what the gut is. And what I'm referring to is your gastrointestinal tract. And the gastrointestinal tract is a 30-foot long system that lives inside your abdomen. And it also has this surface area of roughly a tennis court. And it has this enormous surface area so that it can utilize all the enzymes and mechanical digestion that's necessary to take place to turn all of the food and the fluids that you eat into all of the energy and the structures that you need to perform as an athlete. So there's some key role players, just as there are on your teams, that takes food and fluid that you consume and turns it into those energy and structures that you need. The mouth is where it all starts. And as you chew or masticate, it breaks down the food that you eat mechanically, as well as enzymes start to break down the carbohydrates that you consume primarily. Then food enters your esophagus when you swallow, and as you swallow, this system called peristalsis begins, and that includes nerve innervation from your brain, and that tells your esophagus to move food down through into your stomach. And obviously you don't have to think about this, right? So if you had to think about swallowing it'd be pretty challenging, right? Take quite a while to eat. So luckily this happens automatically. And then food enters your stomach, and your stomach you can think of as like the puffer fish of your gastrointestinal tract or your gut. And it can go from very small, like the size of a tennis ball, and it can increase to 1 or 2 liters to hold all the food you eat. So it's this incredible organ that acts like a puffer fish. And then from your stomach, food enters small intestine, and then enzymes from your pancreas enter there too. And in your stomach, hydrochloric acid starts breaking down proteins, and then in your small intestine, proteins and fats and more carbohydrates are broken down, and they're eventually absorbed into your small intestine. And from there, they enter your bloodstream and get sent to your liver. And in the liver, they are processed. And once your nutrients are processed, they're sent to other tissues in the body so that they can serve their purposes, whether it's for energy or providing structures and supporting your performance. And then last, food is your large intestine, which is a unique organ that we'll talk more about. And then finally, it exits your body as number 2. So what's interesting about this system, a fun fact, is that in a lifetime of eating, this system, the gut, is responsible for digesting what might be up to a rhino's mass worth of protein, a hippo's mass worth of dietary fat, and an elephant's mass worth of carbohydrates. So that's a whole lot of food that this important gut is responsible for assimilating into your body. And also, it's responsible for taking 20,000 gallons of water and turning that into the hydration that you need. Honing in a little bit more on the large intestine, as mentioned, it is a unique organ, and it's not just host to human cells, it's host to 40 trillion bacterial cells that live inside your gut. And that's roughly equivocal to the number of human cells in the entire human body. So with the genes and metabolites that these bacterial cells create together up the biome, it's arguable that we're more host to bacteria or equal hosts to bacteria as we are human. So it's an important symbiotic relationship that we have with these bacterial cells that we host, and they're very important role players in our gut health. So the microbiome breaks down indigestible foods like fiber, and fiber comes often in the forms of vegetables and fruits, and it also comes in things like popcorn and carbohydrates. So it breaks these down, and the byproducts of that is some gases and then also short chain fatty acids. And the lining of your intestines or your gut, those cells use these short chain fatty acids as fuel. So this is where they get their energy from. So we're not just feeding ourselves, we're also feeding these gut bacteria, and they produce fuel for us in our intestines. So an important system in our body is this microbiome that helps protect our gut. So it also fights against pathogens and things we don't want in there. So incredibly important symbiotic relationship that we have with these bacteria in our large intestine. And another interesting fact about the gut is that it also acts as a second brain. And it is a primitive brain in that it can't have cognition and it can't have decision making, but it is an important brain that acts automatically, and this is called our autonomic nervous system. So what's interesting is that it connects with our brain and it actually sends more information than it actually receives. The research on this in terms of specific foods that we can eat to optimize this bidirectional communication system between our first brain and our second brain isn't fully flushed out in terms of what types of foods can optimize things like mood and emotions. But we do know in general that things like mood and emotion and cognition can be impacted by the signals that are sent from our gut to our brain. So the 100 to 600 million neurons that innervate this organ system are in tight communication with our brain, and what we eat can greatly influence how we think. Now, moving on to why this is all important for your performance. And these symptoms are the primary reasons why, as athletes, we should consider gut health as part of our training regimen. And it's these side effects or symptoms of an unhealthy gut that can impact our performance and can actually kill a really solid performance. And these are feelings that I'm sure you've felt before as an athlete. I know I personally have in my past as an athlete, and they are ubiquitous in the athletic world. So many athletes suffer from these symptoms, and they include nausea and vomiting, reflux, regurgitation, and heartburn, that burning sensation in your esophagus, fullness and bloating, side stitch, which is also called transient abdominal pain, and that's that feeling you get inside, particularly in runners, this is common, flatulence or farting, defecation and diarrhea, constipation, and bloody stool. So these are all potential gut symptoms that can impact your performance. And there are many causes to each of these symptoms. So many of these symptoms are multifactorial, and any intervention to approach them also should be multifactorial. But there are these various causes that we can hone in on. And for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to talk about how we can take these potential causes and approach them in order to reduce any gut symptoms that have the potential to impact our performance. So for the rest of the presentation, we'll talk about fiber, fat, and protein. We'll talk about energy balance, dehydration. We'll also talk about certain supplements as well as NSAIDs. And keep in mind with NSAIDs, if you're prescribed NSAIDs from your team physician, it's important to take those, but we'll cover that more later on. And stress and anxiety as well. And this is really zeroing in on that second brain to first brain communication. So first, carbohydrates and fiber. Our gut has, and primarily your intestines, have transporters lining the entire way of your gut. And those transporters are what allows the nutrients that you consume, like carbohydrates, to enter into your bloodstream. And there are various forms of carbohydrates. There's glucose, which is your average sugar that you find in many of your sports drinks, fructose, which is found in fruit and also in many of your sports drinks, sucrose, and others. Each of those has their own exit, basically. You could think of the transporters in your gut as an exit on a freeway. And if we consumed all glucose, that exit would get backed up. Whereas if we consume glucose and fructose, which is how all of your sports drinks and sports foods are formulated to contain those different carbohydrates, we open up another exit for those carbohydrates to enter into our gut. So that way we can handle more traffic, so to say, of carbohydrates. So that's why it's really important to eat multiple forms of carbohydrate and not just eat one kind, like table sugar. We want to eat a variety, like fruit and vegetables and carbohydrates that we get from our sports foods. So another thing to consider with carbohydrates is that often carbohydrates come packaged with fiber. And an example of fibrous food are grains or boom chicka pop or any other kind of popcorn and vegetables. And in order to maintain gut health, we definitely need these foods. It's really important in our overall intake, but they can also slow down digestion. And as mentioned, our gut ferments these fibers. And we'll talk a little bit more about how that works. In all, eating a lot of fiber right before physical activity, within 30 minutes before, that can cause some backup in our gut. And essentially that can also cause some heartburn and indigestion and reflux and some of those not pleasant gut symptoms that can impact performance. So ultimately, we want to avoid eating things like whole grain with, a lot of fiber, or a bag of boom chicka pop right before we go into our physical activity. We can definitely eat those things, including vegetables, but we want to make sure we have ample time before we start exercising for us to digest those foods and for them to leave our stomach. So carbohydrates also, other than providing energy, can help protect the lining of our gut. And this is why it's really important to consume things like sports drinks and get your 30 to 60 grams of carbohydrates for every hour of activity, and to ensure that you're getting your 30 to 60 grams before exercise from non-fiber dense carbohydrate sources. Because in our gut, the way the cells work, they have these tight closures in between all the cells. When we exercise, blood flows away from the gut, and this is often what causes any type of gut symptom. So as blood flows away from these tight closures can open up, and when they open up in the cells in our gut, then it can allow things like to enter into the lining of our gut, and this can cause a leaky inflammation effect. So carbohydrates have been shown to keep these closures tightly packed together, so that not allow unwanted toxins into the lining of our gut, And therefore, we reduce inflammation and reduce any potential negative gut side effects. So carbohydrates provide energy, which is an amazing component of them for performance, but they also help protect any of our gut, help protect against negative symptoms. And it's within these tight junctions or these closures between our gut where we absorb all of the fluids we drink. And this is why your carbohydrate sports drinks are formulated the way they are. We need an optimal balance of carbohydrates and electrolytes. And this is why, again, we supplement with things like Right Stuff when it's appropriate. And we drink Gatorade or Gatorade Endurance. And our sport foods are formulated to have a specific percentage of carbohydrate concentrations in those fluids. Because, as shown in this picture, fluid will from areas of low concentration to areas of high concentration. And if we consumed a high concentration beverage above 6%, which is how our sports drinks are formulated, more water would seep into our gut, and that can cause things like diarrhea or urgency to go, which you definitely don't want during your performance, and you definitely don't want, especially during competition. So here's an example. Gatorade is a 6% carbohydrate drink. Something like orange juice is closer to 10% carbohydrate drink. And that will cause water to go inside your gut rather than staying in your blood. And that will cause things like diarrhea or urgency to go. So that's why we drink Gatorade and not juice when we're out on the field or on the court or wherever it might be that we're performing. So this is an interesting fact about how carbohydrates work in fluid when we consume them. Next is dietary fat. So we all love avocado toast, but it might not be the best food to consume right before competition. And this graph shows the likelihood of having bothersome gut symptoms and the time, the minutes that we eat a dietary fat dense food before we start exercising. So at 0 minutes, which is the start of exercise, if we were to eat a whole pack of Justin's nut butter, which has 19 grams of dietary fat, the chances of having bothersome gut symptoms is really, really high. Rather, if we had that Justin's nut butter packet 2 to 4 hours before we started training, then the likelihood of bothersome gut symptoms from that fat is really low. And the same thing goes for any other dietary fat, like oils and avocado and nuts and seeds and so forth. So I advise when you eat dietary fat as an important part of your overall consumption, I highly recommend allowing enough space between when you eat that food and when you start exercise, ideally at least 2 hours, so that you can move that food through your gut. And the way that this works is dietary fat slows down digestion. So that's why the risk of gut symptoms increases. If we're still digesting food out on the field, it's going to impact our performance. And another thing to consider on dietary fat as well is some of the other foods that you eat right before competition, like a Chewy bar, have 3 grams of fat rather than 19. So that's why those are better carbohydrate sources for fueling your performance. Now we'll talk about protein. So protein, water makes up 60 to 75% of our mass. Protein makes up 15 to 20% of our mass. So we've learned that protein is an extremely important component of our refueling and of our overall fueling. And for all these macronutrients, if you want to learn more about the specific amount of food to eat, then there's plenty of previous Fuel for Thoughts for you to go ahead and watch. And in the matter of gut health, different types of protein can vacate from our stomach at different rates. And as we've kind of discussed, having food in our system while we're out playing or performing can impact our performance and also result in some unwanted gut symptoms. So it's important to consider which type of protein you're eating close to competition. Ultimately, we want to avoid large protein meals within that 30 to 90 minute range. And really, we're looking at a full serving of protein. So having 20 to 40 grams of protein within a half hour before competition is going to slow down digestion, can result in reflux, can result in constipation, can result in other unpleasant gut symptoms that impact our performance. So we want to really save those foods for 2 to 4 hours before, or for our recovery meals. And for our recovery snacks like 4 Power or beef jerky or a Cliff Bar. And then we also want to be mindful of symptoms from low risk supplements. Some people may be sensitive to whey. Although whey protein does not have lactose in it when it's pure whey, we still want to be mindful of the potential for gut symptoms when we consume whey, if you're someone who's sensitive to that specific protein, and then you be well advised to consume less of it. Ultimately, high protein diets and low carbohydrate diets have the potential to negatively impact our gut microbiome. So all of those metabolites that come from digesting the food that we eat in our large intestine, that can become imbalanced when we have an extremely high protein diet with very little carbohydrates. So this is another reason why balance is important for protecting gut health. Now we'll talk about energy, and your overall energy balance impacts your gut health. When we have very low energy intake, it reduces gut motility. So that's the rate at which we move food through our gut, and that can cause negative side effects. Also, when we're under fueling, our organ function suffers. And this is a really important organ system that's impacted by total energy balance. So consuming adequate energy relative to our needs is important for overall gut function. Conversely, or on the other hand, you have athletes whose needs are much higher than the average person, and that requires a lot of food. Very large intakes can cause discomfort. The feeling of fullness is not something we want to feel when we're running. The jostling that happens during physical activity with a full stomach is very uncomfortable. So having very large energy intakes, trying to meet that with very low calorie but high nutrient dense foods like all vegetables and fruits and all good protein dense sources and carbohydrate sources would be a challenge for a typical athlete. So that's why it's advisable to have sports foods like Gatorade, chews, also oils and nuts and seeds, and more energy dense foods like that, so that we can meet our overall energy requirements without having to stuff too much total food into our body. So in order to meet your needs, I recommend those energy dense foods that we provide. And finally, we have dehydration. So having an inadequate hydration, ultimately, when we exercise, fluid goes away, or blood flow goes away from our gut. So blood flow is going to be shunted to other areas where it's needed more, such as our extremities, right? Our muscles, as well as our heart or our brain. And in this chart, you see that the skin receives much more blood flow during physical activity, and this is to regulate your temperature. And blood flows away from your gut. Blood flow being a main reason why we get many of the symptoms we talked about and discomfort during performance. It's blood flowing away from the gut, which causes this discomfort. And hydration, when we have less water, our fluid volume in our blood decreases, and we could get even less blood flow to the gut. So we want to prioritize hydration so that we're getting adequate blood flow and avoiding some of these negative symptoms. Now, many of you will be curious about probiotics when the conversation is around microbiome and around gut health. So with probiotics, it's important to keep in mind that with the research done in athletes, there's some conflicting evidence. And it's also been shown that certain probiotic supplements can worsen guts. So it's not a panacea. We want to be mindful that different probiotic supplements have variable strains. They have variable species of different probiotics that are being used in research, and also variable dosage. So while the information and the research on probiotics is conflicting, it has been shown that the right kinds of supplements can reduce the severity of upper respiratory tract infections in athletes. And it also may protect the lining of your gut, similar to how carbohydrates keep those gaps between cells tightly closed and avoid inflammation. What's really important here is that anyone who's thinking about taking a probiotic supplement should absolutely schedule a consultation with one of our sports RDs, and then we'd be able to assess your specific need and the appropriateness of those supplements, and then recommend a third-party tested supplement that's less risky than one that hasn't been third-party tested. But ultimately, the best way to get probiotics is from healthy gut foods and probiotic containing foods. And the most popular of these is yogurt, right? We have this at the Fuel Bar, and kombucha, which we're not serving now, but is a delicious drink that has plenty of probiotics in it. And sauerkraut or kimchi are also great sources of probiotics. And these help to colonate healthy species of bacteria in our large intestine, which protect us, again, from antigens and pathogens, as well as result in a healthy gut-brain symbiotic relationship. And there are also prebiotic foods, which are like food for those bacteria. And onions and bananas have tons of prebiotics, as well as any of the vegetables and fruits you might eat. And we want to keep in mind leaving adequate spacing, not eating a ton of fiber before consumption, because that slows down digestion and can cause negative gut symptoms. But ton fiber 2 to 4 hours before, 90 minutes, or even eating plenty of vegetables and fruits is critical to our overall gut health. So there are supplements that, besides probiotics, can impact our gut health, and some in not such a great way. And as mentioned, NSAIDs, chronic high dose consumption of NSAIDs, which isn't just taking 2 ibuprofen, it's more higher dose and over a longer period of time, that can have some negative impacts. Rather than popping ibuprofen like candy, make sure you talk with your team physician about an appropriate use for NSAIDs, because they absolutely have one for reducing pain and inflammation, but something to be mindful of. And then other popular supplements, mainly herbals, glutamine, caffeine, sodium bicarbonate, can negatively impact the lining of our gut, which I encourage you to disclose any supplements you're taking to one of our sports RDs, and we can review that supplement for you and see if there's any risky ingredients. And also, we want to be mindful of that some of these supplements are adulterated or have ingredients in them that they don't say they have, or they don't have appropriately labeled supplements. And there's a whole Fuel for Thought on that was just done in the previous episode. So I encourage you to check that out, learn more about supplementation. And lastly, ginger, which has anti-nausea effects, which is a good thing when it comes to protecting our gut health and reducing negative symptoms during competition. But we also want to be mindful that eating a lot of ginger right before we start exercising can cause heartburn, mild heartburn, but we just want to be mindful of the timing of ginger and not consume a lot of it right before we start working out. Ultimately, though, it's a pretty good thing for our gut that we can consume at a good time throughout the day. Now, all of these nutrients are important modulators of our gut health. And probiotics are really important as well, as they exist inside our large intestine. And meal timing or nutrient timing is something that we talk about often when it comes to optimizing your sports performance. And many of us struggle when we are going to a practice at 6 a.m. or an early morning competition, and we have a hard time fueling for that competition or practice appropriately because you're not very hungry when you wake up. The good thing about your gut is that you can train it, and you can actually train yourself by incrementally increasing the amount of, say, carbohydrates or water you drink over a matter of days even. You can train your gut to better tolerate that intake. And by better tolerating that intake, you will reduce symptoms of things like reflux or fullness or bloating or flatulence or other symptoms that could negatively impact your performance. So you can train your gut just like you train your body. It's adaptable, and you could make your body used to higher intakes of certain performance enhancing foods or performance supporting foods rather. And that's not all that we can manipulate. So we have important nutrients and timing that we can utilize to impact our gut health in a positive way and reduce negative symptoms. But as mentioned, the gut also has this second brain and lots of neurons that are innervated between our brain and our gut. And stress and anxiety can impact the function of our gut, because when we're feeling stressed or have anxiety, which is a natural part of living and can't always be avoided, it releases a chemical called CRF, which modifies the activity of your gut via your central nervous system. And stress in that way can shift blood flow away from your gut. And as mentioned, that can have some potential causes of discomfort that can impact your performance. Also, stress can impair the immune system, which having an impaired immune system can impact the health of your gut. Now, all of these things, normal levels of stress and anxiety exist in all of us. And if you feel like you have more stress and anxiety than normal, we have Sports Psych, which is an extremely helpful resource for all of us. And they're going to be doing a Fuel for Thought as well on December 3rd. So keep in mind that they're the professionals in this regard and can be referred to at any time. The research on this isn't 100% solid, right? So we're not exactly 100% sure on how this communication between the gut and the brain works. But we do know that there's a possibility for stress and anxiety to impact our gut health. And for some tips on managing stress and anxiety, check out that Sports Psych presentation coming on December 3rd. And also you can follow Sports Psych at their Instagram account, which is listed on the slide, and use sports psychology. But there are some very low risk strategies that you can use that have been used to reduce gut dysfunction and also just help us calm down and feel relaxed before competition. And the way these work is by dampening the sympathetic nervous system, which is that fight or flight nervous system, and promoting parasympathetic activity. So that's the rest and digest that helps you get your food moving through your gut and reducing gut symptoms. And these are as simple as doing some slow, deep breathing, practicing mindfulness, which means paying attention in a particular way on purpose in the present moment, and listening to some relaxing music. So hopefully all this information is very useful for you and applicable for you in your day-to-day life. And just as a summary, we want to ensure we're getting carbohydrate sources, a variety of forms, and getting appropriate timing on that, not eating a lot of fiber, greater than 5 to 10 grams within 30 minutes before we move around, not having high fat meals right before we work out, allowing adequate spacing between exercise, as well as high protein dense meals. And we want to have a balance with protein and other nutrients in our overall intake. And then all of these other factors like supplementation can impact health, and we can all have more of the psychological component of sport and gut health. I appreciate your time, and hopefully you find this useful. And if you have questions for me, just let me know. I'm always around the field bar. And with that, I will hand it back to Katie to wrap us up.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Alex. That was excellent information and curated in a really practical way. I have a couple of questions that have come through for you. So the first question I have is from our athletes that have multiple competitions or sections of competitions in a day. So this could be, our wrestlers, our swimmers, our fencers, for example. Do you have some kind of go-to items that you would recommend that they kind of keep in their bag in terms of easily digestible foods that could be consumed, at different times, just to help them be prepared for fueling within an hour or fueling within 2 hours? Any go-to items that you would just say, make sure you have those?
Yes, and that's the exact way to think about it. How much time you have between bouts of competition. So if it's 30 minutes and even 2 hours, you're going to consume something that's easily digestible, that doesn't have a ton of fiber, that isn't very high in protein, that isn't high in dietary fat. So foods like applesauce, chewy bars. We have other of the sports foods like chews and fruit snacks. Those are all delivering carbohydrates and that are easily digestible, enter our gut and our blood quickly. So not spending a lot of time in our digestive tract, which can cause discomfort. So the primary ones I would think about are those pre-fuel foods that you see in the fuel bar: applesauce, chews, fruit snacks, chewy bars, and those easily digestible carbohydrate sources. If you have longer than 2 to 4 hours, then you can start to consider having a smaller meal consisting of a little bit of protein and some more fiber dense foods like vegetables and fruits.
Amazing. I have a couple more.
Yes.
We have somebody who is concerned about reactive hypoglycemia, just with the high sugar foods that you're recommending. Do you have some recommendations as far as how to avoid, the low sugar that can come after the spike in some of these scenarios?
Yes, and one thing that can contribute to hypoglycemia is having poorly formulated foods, even that have too high of a concentration of sugar molecules or of carbohydrates. So something like an orange juice which is 10% carbohydrates versus which is more like 6% carbohydrate. Those foods cause an irregular absorption of water into the lining of our gut and can also contribute to that hypoglycemic effect. So mostly focusing on those ideally formulated foods like Gatorade is one way to ensure that you're not going to have too much of a hypoglycemic event. Also, having less than 50 grams of carbohydrates in a fluid is another way to avoid hypoglycemia. So fluids with greater than 50 grams, you want to be a little bit more cognizant of the potential effect for hypoglycemia. And most of the snacks that we have at the fuel bar don't have greater than 50 grams of carbohydrates in a drink or a fluid. And then we also want to be mindful of what are your specific needs. So based on how much you weigh, right, your pounds or kilograms, we can determine how much carbohydrates in a day that you need. and then allowing for adequate spacing of those carbohydrates throughout the day. So having something like an applesauce might not affect someone who's 150 pounds, but it could affect someone who's much younger and potentially 75 pounds, right? So we want to be mindful of what are our relative needs, and then how do I space those throughout the day? So you're not consuming a lot of high glycemic carbohydrates greater than 150 grams within 1 minute of each other. And those numbers aren't completely specific just because our weight varies, our needs vary. But that is another thing to be mindful of, and something that you can consult with a sports RD to try to figure out specifically how to approach that.
Perfect. And then the last one is just about an athlete who has a really difficult time eating breakfast, has never eaten breakfast before morning training sessions ever. Can you just kind of talk about what maybe the first steps might be for them? And then also, why you would be so inclined to, recommend going through that training of the gut for this particular type of athlete?
Yes, definitely. And this is something that many athletes come across, is not having the desire to eat during an early morning training session. And you simply might not feel hunger. And that's certainly one component. You also might feel like you will get nauseous if you eat really early in the morning. And that's also very normal. And while that's true, it's also possible to train your gut to be able to tolerate the intake of certain foods. We need to keep in mind that pre-fuel is really important for our overall performance and our health and training state. So if that is an issue that you experience, start small, really small. Have a few squeezes of an applesauce pouch to start, a really small amount of applesauce, like a tablespoon. And then the next day, try having 2 tablespoons and see how you tolerate that. And then the next day, 4 tablespoons and see how you tolerate that. And eventually get up to a full packet of applesauce before you practice in the morning. And you can also start just by sipping on a little bit of Gatorade or Gatorade Endurance and see how you tolerate a few sips before or during early morning training. And then build on that within a matter of days. We can actually increase the number of transporters in our gut by training our gut like this and helping to absorb those nutrients. And we also build a tolerance to some of those foods. So I recommend starting with foods that you believe will fuel you, yet are palatable. You enjoy the foods that you can consume before training, and start small. If you believe that yogurt is a food that you enjoy that will fuel you, you would want to have just a few bites rather than trying to eat a whole container. So in that way, we can train our mind and our gut to be able to tolerate those foods.
Awesome. Very good. All right. Well, that is all the time we have today. Thank you so much, Alex, for sharing this awesome information. And just a reminder to everyone on the call that this has been recorded and will be posted onto our YouTube channel within the next week. So thank you so much, everybody. Have a great day.
Thanks.